Hi, welcome to Get Into Woodworking with me, Mitch Peacock. And on today's episode, we're going to be looking at hand planes, spoke shaves, and we're also going to be making a start on a little box. This is an example of a premium hand plane, and it's by Lee Nielsen. It comes with a nice finish to the woodwork and all the metalwork. The sole of the plane is made of ductile iron, which is less prone to rusting than the cheaper planes which are made in cast iron. And it's a very nice plane. It takes less setting up time than cheaper planes, and if you really get into woodworking, then it's something you may like to consider. However, to begin with, you can pick up a cheap hand plane like this. This one's quite a few years old, and nowadays you'll have plastic handles, but the basic principle is the same. The blade is held at an angle on top of a slope, and in the more expensive planes that slope is called a frog and is movable, and on this cheaper plane and on many cheaper planes the frog is part of the casting for the sole of the plane, the main body. So there are less adjustments available on this type of plane, but we can still make this plane work quite well, and we can get a feel for how to plane and how to sharpen a plane blade. And at this early stage in your woodworking, I think it's just as well to spend a few pounds on a plane like this and then see how you get on, and invest more a little bit further down the line. So just taking a closer look at this cheaper plane, it's about 9 inches long by about 2 inches wide, and is equivalent to somewhere between a number 3 and a number 4 bench plane. It has a handle at the back which is called the tote, and a knob on the front, and they afford a really good grip on the plane for its use. In this central area you'll see a couple of knurled nuts and a knurled bolt here. If we undo this, we'll find a thick piece of metal which is called a lever cap. Basically what it does is presses down hard on the blade to stop it moving. The plane blade itself is a flat piece of tool steel with a few cutouts to help hold it and adjust it in the plane. There's not much else to this plane. The slope, as I say, the frog, is cast into the main body and it can't be moved. That's at an angle of 45 degrees. It has 2 pieces of studded rod coming up here with knurled nuts on the top, and they engage in the slots at the side of the iron, the blade, and move it up and down in the plane. I'll just point out here that the bevel on the blade goes down in the plane. If we look underneath, we can see a slot across the sole of the plane. That's the sole, and there's a slot across there. It's called the mouth, and that's where the sharp end of the blade emerges from the bottom of the plane, and we adjust how much the blade comes out using these 2 knurled nuts. Before we start planing, we should pull that blade back so that it's level with the sole of the plane, and so it won't contact anything underneath. And we can test that with a little piece of wood and run that along the sole, and it's not catching on the blade. Using the plane's quite simple. Have a rough piece of wood here. We want to make that nice and smooth. At the moment, if we put the plane on there with the iron set where it is and move the plane across the wood, nothing happens. So what we want to do is just gradually twist the nail nuts to push the blade down a little bit, just a little bit at a time. And you start to hear it's just kissing the wood. A little bit more. And it takes a shaving. Now if we do that along the full length of the work, a couple of times, and we start to end up with a lovely smooth finish. And it's taking a shaving for the full length of that wood, just a thin amount, and gradually getting rid of all that roughness. If you extend the blade too far, you won't be able to push the plane along the wood. It will dig in far too much and you won't be able to put enough force onto the plane. So if you get yourself a little plane to play with, try setting it up, setting the blade to take reasonably thin shavings, and just practice getting shavings along the full length of a piece of wood. And we'll talk a lot more about planes in future episodes. The next tool I'm going to talk about is the spoke shave. Basically it's a plane, the body is completely different, it's held across the direction in which it's travelling rather than in line with the direction, but it still has a sole, a flat blade, a lever cap, and usually some knurled nuts on studding to advance and retract the blade. And its purpose is to work on wood that is curved. We adjust the plane in the same way that we did the bench plane, and it will take shavings from a curved surface. There's a big range of price in spoke shaves, but this one only cost £5. Now I know you'll be as pleased as I am that we've covered enough of the basic tools to be able to make a start on a little box. I've got hold of some pine match boarding. It's about 1/4 of an inch, a little bit thicker than that, so we don't need to make it any thinner. That would be great. Our first little box will be basically a little tray. One piece about 8 inches long will be used as a base. I'll cut these two pieces down the middle to produce 2 sides and then 2 ends. And I'm at the end of the slim bench, and we'll talk another time about clamps and cramps, but suffice to say it's a lot easier to hold your work to the workbench with clamps than just doing it with your hand. So I'm using a couple of C clamps or C cramps, also known as G clamps or G cramps. Just putting a little spacer underneath the head of the clamp so we don't mar the work. I've marked 2 boards with a line down the middle, and I'm going to rip those 2 boards to prepare stock for both the sides and the ends of the box. With a longer clamp we can clamp the boards onto the edge of the bench to plane the sawn side nice and smooth. We want to check with a tri-square that the face of the work is square to the side that we're planing. Once we get full length shavings, then we know that that surface is nice and smooth for the whole length. Now with the marking gauge set to the height that we want the box to be, the height of the sides, we can mark that width on these 4 boards that we prepared. And then we simply plane down to that line and we'll have a board that's parallel within its width. I hope you can see here that we have more material to remove at this end than we do at this other end. We don't want to remove much material at this end, so what we'll do is start with the blade of the plane just forward of that point and then pass the plane through the rest of the work. Gradually the distance away from the line at this end will get closer and closer to what it is at that end. And once they're the same, then we'll continue with plane strokes right the way through. Now it's virtually the same, so I'll take plane strokes right the way through. But I'll keep checking to see that I'm getting close to the line equally at both ends. Almost there. When you get virtually to the line, you'll see that the edges will feather up very easily, and you know you're only a couple of strokes away. And that's great. The result is 4 pieces of wood, all the same width. Just what we need for our sides and ends. I've also planed off the tongue and groove from what's going to be our base. I'm happy with the width of this as being the size of the base, but we need to adjust the length according to the sides that we've got. I think these 2 pieces will make good sides, but they both have rather nasty knots at the end, so I want to remove those. To mark the sides up for length, first of all I want to cut the knots off. So I use a tri-square, line it up so the knots are off the end, and use a marking knife, or you could use a pencil to make a mark right the way across. Now we can use our cross-cut saw to cut those 2 ends off. As I showed you when we talked about saws in the previous video, to start sawing I'm going to make a little notch in the end with the knife, so I've got somewhere to rest my blade up against. And I've got the part clamped to the bench on top of a sacrificial base so the saw won't mark the top of the bench, and I've also got a spacer in there to prevent the clamp from marring the work. We should find that that's a nice square end. Now we just need to prepare the other end square and cut the other side to the same length. For the first iteration of this box, we're going to have a simple base glued between two sides which overlap the end, and then two end pieces that fill in that gap. So we'll need to prepare the base to be shorter than the sides by the width of two of the ends. So firstly we'll prepare a square end on it. So we have a square end, which we'll put down at this end. We want the length of the side, which would place us, we mark it with a knife there, and then we want two thicknesses of the ends, so two sections that were going to be the ends. We pop the knife back in where we made the mark and push those over with the tri-square until it's nice and tight. And then mark it. To double check it, we can place a side on there. See the overlap, put one end piece in and flush those two pieces up, and there should be enough room here between the score line and the end of the side to fit one more end in, and that's just perfect. So we'll cut the other end of the base. I've just squared up one end of the piece we're going to use for the ends of the box. Now I need to mark it to length, and the length of the end is exactly the same as the width of the base. So if I line those up together, pressing them up to the stock of a square is always a good idea. Then I can mark with a knife the width of the base. And use the square to mark that across. And remember, this is the end that we want, so our saw cut needs to be on this side of the marked line. So we'll turn it all round and notch into this side. That sawn end should be square, which it is, so we can now mark for the other end. So we have a base, one end, side, another side, and a final end. There's our simple box, and you can now glue it up. To glue up your box, find a piece of melamine or put some plastic down on a flat surface. Put some glue round each of the edges of the base, lay that flat down, place one side against one edge of the base, then glue the ends of each end piece, put that in position, same with the other one, put that in position, then put your final side on, position it nice and tight on the base, and to hold it whilst it glues, use some clear adhesive tape to wrap around the corners. This design does have a few flaws and we'll improve on it in future episodes, but I suggest you make one of these boxes, glue it up, and you can use it as reference to see how you progress as your woodworking improves.